All right, so in this video, I'm going to be starting chapter 10, which is going to be on photosynthesis. This first video is just going to be kind of an overview of where it takes place and kind of what's the purpose of it. So, um, one thing that you want to be familiarized with is the two terms autotroph versus heterotroph. Um, Autotrophs are basically anything that can actually do photosynthesis. In terms of that, they can actually produce their own food source. Now, I'm not going to fixate so much on these chemiotrophs. That's where, in terms of their energy source, they get things like ammonia or anything like iron. But the big thing that we should at least kind of make sure that you guys are aware of are photoautotrophs, where their energy source is light. The one you guys are going to be the most familiarized with are plants and algae. Um, but one thing that I do want to at least make a mention of are cyanobacteria and bacteria because depending on the species, all cyanobacteria, these ones actually can do photosynthesis. Um, so just remember that certain bacterial species actually are able to do photosynthesis if they are cyanobacteria. And the process of what this is all about will look the same. Um, the heteroautotrophs are going to be able to actually obtain that energy of those organic compounds, meaning glucose, from things that do photosynthesis. So understand that. And this is kind of that circle of life in the sense that anything that can actually do photosynthesis, in terms of what they're producing, they produce out these organic compounds, which really is going to be glucose and oxygen. We need that. So we're going to take in those organic compounds, take in that oxygen to do respiration. Our byproducts of respiration are what are going to be the reactants for photosynthesis. So you most definitely want to be familiarized with that. And here's just another thing talking about these photoautotrophs. But again, certain species, depending on the prokaryotic species, are actually able to do photosynthesis. So this is going to be a kind of a nice starting point where I want to emphasize both autotrophs and heterotrophs can perform cellular respiration, but only autotrophs can perform photosynthesis. But don't forget, plants definitely do cell respiration. So don't forget, plants can actually do both. They do a lot of photosynthesis, but they also do a lot of respiration. So understanding that, you'll be in good shape. So, but only in terms of heterotrophs, things like you and me, or anything that just does respiration, we're going to be referred to as heterotrophs. So let's look at the actual anatomy quickly of the chloroplast. So there's a lot going on when you look at a leaf. You have these little stomatas that's going to let gases in and out. Specifically, CO2 goes in, oxygen comes out, and those are going to be basically on the epidermis layer of each leaf. Now, this is basically taking a snapshot. This whole thing is not a plant cell. This is just one chloroplast within the plant cell. So when you look at the leaf, stomatas are something that you should be aware of in terms of letting carbon dioxide in, letting oxygen out. And that's something that you at least want to be familiarized with. Now, each one of these little green-looking sacs are going to be referred to as your thylakoids. But if you have a group of them together, that's going to be called a granum. Now, the fluid inside these little thylakoids is going to be referred to as the lumen. And a couple things about thylakoids is that's where your light reactions are going to take place, and also that's where your chlorophyll is going to be, and all these other pigments that we're going to talk about here. So everything else in terms of the thylakoid, the stroma is going to be all this excess fluid inside this chloroplast would be referred to as the stroma. So I do want to make sure you guys feel okay on this. When you look at a chloroplast, I'll say this, that one plant cell has multiple chloroplasts. So if you look right here, if one of these is a complete plant cell, each one of those really dark green specks is going to be referred to as a chloroplast. So when you look at plant cells, one plant cell can actually have multiple chloroplasts. So let's get into a little bit of what you should know in terms of light and the spectrum of energies that we should really be concerned with. And the biggest thing, it's not too terrible. You just want to at least understand that wavelengths in sunlight are visible light. And in terms of the spectrum and photons, you just need to know that there's going to be some form of energy being carried. Okay, so photons are going to be carrying energy. And depending on the color of light, they're going to be carrying different forms of energy. So when you have really short wavelengths, that's going to be really, really high energy, things like blues and violets. And this is referring to the actual wavelengths. So the longer the wavelengths are going to be lower energy, so things like reds and oranges. So when you look at this, those would be essentially like the distance from peak to peak would be about 700 nanometers. But if you have something like blues and violets, those are going to have really short wavelengths. So the shorter the wavelengths, this is what this is telling you, the more energy that they're actually going to be carrying. So you want to understand that. So that's the spectrum. Just understand that these infrareds, the larger the wavelengths, the less energy it's carrying. The shorter the wavelengths, the higher the energy. So that's something to at least make sure you're understanding. Now, with that, I do want you to understand that plants can absorb more than one type of wavelength depending on the pigments that they're going to have in their cells. So if you look here, this is kind of just a generic overview. And what this is representing is that light that is actually going to be emitting all of these different colors. It's releasing all this energy, and the plant can absorb all of these colors if it has the right pigments. Now, if you look here, it's reflecting this green color. That means that it does not have the pigments to actually absorb that. So in terms of what you should really care about are these pigments are able to absorb these colors, okay? Now, this is a little premature, especially if you're watching this for the first time, but pigments are going to be in the photosystems. So basically what this is emphasizing is that depending on the type of plant, there's going to be these little tiny pigments in these photosystems that are allowing them to actually absorb this, okay? And I think this goes without saying, but I do want to emphasize this, that the more light absorbed is going to be directly related to an increase in photosynthesis. So that's something that you at least want to be understanding. The more light that a plant can absorb through these pigments, the easier it's going to be for it to do photosynthesis. So I just wanted to put that out there. So it's not too terrible. The higher energies are going to be these shorter wavelengths, so things like blues and purples, things that have long wavelengths, things like reds and oranges, not as much energy. So let's look at this. This is going to be something that you should at least understand at a pretty generic level. It's not terrible by any means. But my question on this is, why do plants have more pigments? Well, remember, more light absorption is going to directly correlate to more photosynthesis. Now, I'm going to just emphasize this right now, that each pigment is specific to the wavelength it can absorb. So each pigment is specific to the wavelength it absorbs. So you guys are probably going to be the most familiar with chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is just one class of pigment. There's other types of pigments. So let's just take a look and appreciate this graph here. So this is talking, your x-axis is going to be the wavelength. The y-axis is how much these plants actually absorbed that wavelength, okay? So each one of these represents pigments. So if you look at chlorophyll A looks like it absorbs at two places. It looks like it absorbs right around a little over maybe 410 to 415. And then there's another really high absorption right here at about I'd say like 670. So basically chlorophyll A, I would say, is able to absorb at about 410 and 670. Now again, what is the point of absorbing this? Well, it's going to be used for photosynthesis. So it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for a plant to have evolved to just have one pigment. So plants have actually evolved to have what are considered accessory pigments, and they're going to help that chlorophyll in capturing even more light energy. So we have alternative pigments as well. So if you look at chlorophyll B, well, chlorophyll B these things are going to help absorb light at around, I'd say maybe right dead center at 450. And then there's also an absorption spectrum right here at around maybe 630. So chlorophyll A absorbs at the blues and the orange. So I'll say at 450 and 630. And the carotenoids are going to help just absorb blues only. And there's a pretty broad spectrum of these carotenoids. So if you look at it's in purple, these carotenoids are only absorbing the blues. So again, the more light absorbed, the better it's going to be at photosynthesis. And it's doing this by pigments. So common test questions that you might run into would be, well, what if chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B were non-existent in this plant, and you were only able to absorb blue light by the carotenoids? You want to make sure you can have that understanding. Now, let's talk briefly before we move on the actual kind of flat line right here. So this is showing you that according to what this data is telling me, this plant can't absorb any of the greens and greens and yellows. So if I grew this plant just with this wavelength of light, it wouldn't be able to grow because it's not able to absorb any light here. If it grew in reds and orange light, if I had like one of those lamps that just could kind of emit this wavelength, it would do okay. It would do the best if it had the whole spectrum, or really just the blues and purples and reds and oranges. So you'll get kind of scenarios that you might have to be able to explain in that sense. So when you look through all of this, hopefully you got to understand the bigger picture here, where the more light absorbed, the better it's a photosynthesis. It's going to be these pigments that are going to help absorb specific light wavelengths. So the last thing that I do need to kind of introduce in this video is what is going to be happening here with the actual equation. So I certainly hope that you can spend some time and memorize the equation, or at least be super familiar with it. So here's kind of a nice overview. This is talking about carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is going to be taken in. And again, this goes in through those stomatas. We'll talk about that too. And it takes in water, right? So if you look here, this little nice, simple, cartoony picture, water goes in through the roots. So you might get a water potential question here where you have a lower water potential of the roots because there's a bunch of starch stored in these roots. Water is actually going to want to go into the roots and then do that capillary action climbing up. And that water actually has to get to the leaf, okay? So I really want to point this out now. Don't think that plants are doing a lot of photosynthesis down here in the roots. They're not. Photosynthesis is really going to be taking place in the leaves. So water has to actually get there. And when you water plants, you don't water at the leaf. You're wasting water. You have to water them at the roots. Water starts climbing up. It gets to the leaf. And that's where this water is coming from. So in terms of this, let's just remember the byproducts of photosynthesis. You make glucose and oxygen as your byproduct. Like I mentioned, it's really just the reverse of respiration. So it makes glucose, but remember that this can be referred to in a question as glucose. But it can also be stored as starch or cellulose. So remember, starch and cellulose are going to be the polysaccharides here. So oftentimes people are like, oh, if they gave you a test question and they use starch, that might throw you off as a byproduct of photosynthesis. That's still correct. Remember, starch and cellulose are just polysaccharides. So photosynthesis is going to be broken up into two main parts: the light reaction, which is basically, if we're thinking about this, it requires light, but basically this is going to make ATP and NADPH for the Calvin cycle, okay? And a Calvin cycle is actually where you actually are building glucose. So that's kind of a nice overview. And remember, carbon dioxide goes in through the stomatas. Oxygen is going to leave through those little stomatas that open and close. Let's let's wrap up this video just talking about the overview here. So water goes in. This whole thing is a thylakoid, not a plant cell. Just remember that. This whole thing is a chloroplast. Each one of these little things is called the thylakoid. The stack is called the granum. So, and remember, a plant cell can have many, many chloroplasts. So this happens a lot. So water comes in, and water is actually going to be split. One of the byproducts of the light reaction is going to be oxygen. So keep track, that's going to be the oxygen that you breathe in. Like I mentioned a second ago, is that really the purpose of the light reaction is a couple of things. 3 products are produced in the light reaction. You have oxygen, you also make some ATP and NADPH, okay? Now the whole point of this is to power the Calvin cycle. And Calvin cycle is going to be a anabolic pathway where you're actually trying to build something. So you're basically taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you're gonna reshuffle that to build your glucose or your sugar, right? So this is kind of a nice overview. A really common test question I see a lot is, well, if you've traced or followed this oxygen from water, where does that oxygen end up? Well, it gets split off and it actually becomes O2. I've also seen other test questions where it says, well, where does the carbon from the carbon dioxide end up? That carbon ends up on a carbon in the sugar that is produced, okay? So I'm just gonna end that there. For just kind of a basic overview. But actually, before I do that, I do want to kind of point this out at the very, very end. You need to at least understand this, okay? Why do plants need to do this? Not just to give us food, but biologically, why did they need it? Well, remember that they're going to need sugar for respiration. And that typically is going to be taking place in the roots. And also, they're going to have to make that sugar for their cell wall, and that's going to be stored as cellulose. So really, just don't forget like it's good to have at least 1 or 2 basic reasons why a plant themselves would have to make glucose. So if you go back to this little picture, all these roots have a ton of starch, and it makes sense because that's where the roots actually grow and extend out. So that's where all this glucose is needed down here, because these roots are actually going to grow out even further, and it does that via cell respiration. So it needs a bunch of ATP. All these cells are dividing. It takes ATP to do that. So realistically, all the ATP that gets made here, excuse me, not ATP, all the sugar that gets made here actually moves down to the roots. Some of them also get stored as cellulose in the cell wall. So just understand that, and that's a nice little overview of the basics of photosynthesis. The next 2 are going to be more specific on the light and the Calvin cycle.